You can load in this scene from the project content directory that comes with the training. It's called rivers_001, and it's what we're going to be starting with to add rivers to this terrain. So at the moment, this terrain is pretty even overall. We have a few low areas, but overall, a fairly equal distribution between the smoother zones and the flatter zones, along with some of the rockier peaks. And we will be scaling this down on the z-axis. But first what we're going to do is load in or edit the altitude production in order to use a quick filter to add rivers to just about any procedural. Now if you edit this node, I am using a create random vector meta node, which just generates a random vector number and vector output. That's used to control the origin of this terrain. The rough output is used to control the materials connected, at least the two individual material distributions as part of mixed materials, which I'll show you. If we edit the material, we can see it is comprised of a mixed material as the main material, and each mix has its own mixed material, and those individual distributions are connected to the rough external dependency. The overall material distribution is not connected to that and uses the influence of environment in order to distribute the material. So back, right-clicking, edit the object to get into the terrain editor, and then we edit the altitude production. The on-off meta node that is connected to this is just a quick switch between the rough area output and the altitude reduction. That way, if I want to modify the rough area size, which is the second output of the terrain fractal to detect rough areas, I then have a preview of that. So I can just turn off the rough areas very quickly and easily. So I'm going to even this out to more what it looks like at the moment, and we select the link between the altitude and the last node in the chain. And if you're using this technique on any other terrain, you always want to make sure that this is going to be the last sequence of nodes. So we're going to start by selecting that link and adding in a filter in between the chain. And what we can do is select the absolute wave. And by default, really depending on the output from the fractal, it's already kind of added in rivers. As we can see, some of these red lines showing up. And just for the sake of this technique, I am going to go into my color map. Select the bottommost key point, edit the color, and change it to blue. And that way we'll be able to see where the rivers are going to be showing up, provided that we have the terrain being heavily extruded, because this won't be our final output, but it does give us a sense of where those rivers are. So what I like to do is set the contrast to 1, and then adjust the brightness in order to place rivers. So I set that to -1 for the brightness, and we can see a lot more rivers showing up. We could also set that to -2, and now we're not going to see as much. And depending on the output and how much we're affecting the terrain, you do have the possibility of kind of creating this effect on the higher points of elevation instead of the lower ones. So I'm going to use -1, which seems to work quite well for this output. If we take a look at the number output before we reach that filter, we're basically working between values of 0.5 and negative 0.5. So that seems to work well between that range. So we can go ahead and click OK and take a look at the terrain. We can see all these winding rivers. One of the drawbacks to this technique is that although it is a nice quick way to auto-generate rivers, you do tend to run into a problem where not necessarily every single river is going to be connected. And that's really going to depend on the output from the fractal. So you can modify the output if we needed to adjust. And what I'm going to do is select the link before this wave, because we do want that to be the last output. And we can change that filter, since it's automatically going to create the last filter we were just using or selected on. And I'm going to switch this over to the map filter. Change our lower value to -1. Lower for the output range. The input we're going to set -0.5 and the upper value to 0.5. That will bring us to the -1, +1 output, because the terrain itself was only within the values of the input range, which you see just by using the output observer. So now we have a value between -1 and almost all the way up to +1. In some of the areas it does go a bit lower, but we can see it's very close. And because we set automatic extension and turn it on, we can see that some of the terrain is going slightly above. So if we need to modify the upper value for the input range of the map, we could set that to 0.6. And if it's the negative that's going over, it'll also have an auto extension. So we could do that for the negative, and it looks like that was what was extending. So now we're working with a value between -1, +1, and just by clicking only when saturating and turning it off, immediately it'll auto-fit. If auto-fit is on, stretching it out a little more. And click OK. And now we have a few more rivers, and they're more likely to be connected. If needed, you can adjust the input and output range before reaching that absolute wave filter in order to customize it a little more. Also, modifying the absolute wave filter can produce the same effect. But the only thing you really want to pay attention to and watch out for is if you're seeing these seams and separations on the terrain itself and the altitude values and the parts that extruded upward. So we can go ahead and click OK and see the terrain in the scene. Right now the ground plane is clipping this out, so I'm going to move it above. And if we just have a little bit of intersection between the ground plane and the terrain, we can see those rivers showing up. So I'm going to switch to the scale gizmo and just scale down the overall height of the terrain. One mistake a lot of people make is they extrude the terrain far too high for the size they're trying to represent, and it isn't as realistic if that's what you're going for. And if you want to have a much higher peak elevation, then you really want to modify the fractal for small individual zones. So now we can see a render without any water in the scene. And with the current setup, this works really well for very thin rivers to represent a very large terrain, very large scale. And in this case, the terrain is still a little too high because some of these areas are just protruding too much. And if we were to have that thin of a river, I would want the elevation to be slightly reduced. So let's go ahead and add in, we're going to use the sea object to create the rivers. And there's a couple of reasons why we're using the sea object rather than another type of infinite plane. And we'll take a look at that once we start working on the material. But I'm going to add in the sea, and go over to the numerics tab and adjust its height with the gizmo, because it's going to be a much more gradual effect. If we need to, we can select both the sea and the terrain and move those down to reach where the ground plane currently is. And then I'm going to delete the ground plane. And we're going to use just the sea level object for the infinite plane, because it is in fact an infinite plane. And if you're using displacement, it is an infinite terrain. At least the same sort of system and setup. So now if you're having trouble really seeing the terrain itself and the intersection with the water and the sea object, you can go over to the first tab where the material is. Instead of using the auto color, I'm going to switch it to blue. And that will basically remove the transparency that is part of the material link and the auto color. Now, I don't want to use the sea material that is automatically applied, although we will be taking parts of it later. What I'm going to do is replace it with the channel water preset to start with, which is located under liquids in the collections that come with View. The meta waters are the waters that are connected to the internal edit object options. Actually, I'm just going to close this out really quick. If we edit the object, the sea, we can see the water surface options. Those are tied directly to the material commands, mainly on the bump channel, unless you have a displaced surface. Then it has its own function, just like a procedural terrain function. So we'll load in the channel water material from liquids as our starting point. And we may need to make some modifications to the material because I'm not really sure how transparent it's going to be. But if we take a look at the terrain, we can see some nice river systems being created overall. Now, as the plane or the sea level object becomes so close to the bottom of the terrain, because of the clipping, it might be difficult to see exactly where it's going to be showing up. There are also some other factors in the way I have my fractal modified, mainly being the fact that I'm using absolutely no z-scale on the terrain fractal, which generates a much faster OpenGL preview, lower quality preview, and in fact can increase render speed of the terrain because the z-scale typically isn't used. There are restrictions because of that, mainly to do with modifying the origin on the z-scale. But that requires a separate kind of explanation. So that's one of the reasons why the terrain geometry is set so low. And that is independent of the instant draw, which I currently have cranked up all the way, and a lot of other limiting features turned off. So let's take a look at a render now with the sea object. And we will be making some modifications to the channel water preset. And there's also a couple things you can notice. We have these very large smooth areas that are ending up a lot higher than the more mountain-like rockier surfaces. And that has to do with a couple of different things built into the terrain fractal. And we're going to be modifying a lot of that later. But you can see overall a pretty decent river system. We'll also be modifying a few other kind of specialty settings for any sort of transparent surface or reflective surface, anything with highlights. And for the most part, what we're seeing is really the material doesn't change good enough where it's starting to meet the water, and we haven't really defined the riverbanks. which is why I say that this default startup or setup with just the filter in it itself is really good for smaller rivers, because it creates just kind of a seam around those starting river areas, and it doesn't really have a fall off to define the river bank. So the next thing we're going to do is first set up the material to define the riverbanks, and then also modify the geometry in order to customize exactly where the water meets the terrain. Now, using the Rivers2 file, we're going to add in first the material to define the riverbank. And there are a few things to pay attention to, especially when using the sea level object for this. So let's go ahead and get ourselves close to the riverbank and select the procedural terrain and edit the material. Now, because we have a mixed material, we do not have the ability to add a layer on top of it. We can, in fact, select Ecosystem, which will, in fact, add a layer on top and allow us to add additional layers. So it's a little trick to create a layered material out of a mixed material. And it looks like all of my scales are still the same, where I had 0.2 for the scale of the grass. And keeping everything scale of 1 so that the ecosystem layer doesn't modify anything beyond that. So before I delete the ecosystem layer, I'm going to add in the layer I'm going to be using for the sand, or whichever material you want to use for the bank around the river. So I'm going to add in a layer, and I'm just going to use one of the view materials using the brown sand from material layers. Click OK. And now this has a built-in alpha, so we're going to edit the function and delete that alpha production for now. Click OK. And I also want to modify the filter, edit filter, and bring down that right point. And that should help remove all of the alpha. And what we're primarily going to be using is the Environment tab. The presets right now are pretty open, which is nice. It doesn't have a lot of extra values to reset. I am going to set the fuzziness, the steep value, to 0.1. Now, whenever you're using any value that isn't an exact number, I'm going to click OK, and we're going to see that's going to show up as 0. And it does round to the next percent. However, the 0.1 is still effective in initiating the fuzziness value. So even though it shows up as 0, it is in fact 0.1 still. So if we take a look at the altitude range, right now it's set by object, so the scale of the object itself. We can also use by material. So if the material is applied to multiple objects, it will in fact apply to all of the objects or equally with the same material. So if the elevation changes, that needs to be taken into account for things like altitude range. Instead, I want to use the absolute. This will give us real-world units based on the scale of the object. Now, with the sea level object, one thing you want to note is that the sea level determines 0, and you might not always have a correct range for the altitude. Modifying the sea level will, in fact, move the altitude range, which is a good thing, and it makes it a little bit easier to set this up without having to create a graph for it, or set up anything related to the distance to the object below. So we want the altitude range to make sure that it's extending below 0, and that way it's going below the water. And our maximum height, I'm going to start with 1 meter, which is probably going to be too high, but we'll just go ahead and try it out first. I'm going to extend the altitude range at the bottom to -5, just to make sure we're going beyond and then we don't have any fall-offs. The alpha boost at 0, just making sure sometimes if you load it in, the alpha boost will be set to 100% depending on the material. So we do want to make sure that's set to 0 so that we don't have any modifications of these settings beyond what we enter in. So go ahead and take a look at a render. So we can see that material extending and going up to a meter above. And because we don't have a fuzziness value set for the top, it is going to be a very harsh cutoff. We can also see that very fine line caused by the absolute wave. So we will be modifying the riverbank and modifying the terrain to customize the riverbank. But first, I just wanted to set up the initial material to give us a little better judge what it is we're working with here. So I'm going to select the material again, and for the fuzziness we want to work with the top because that is the top of the layer. I know that 1% is going to be a little bit too much, and these fuzziness values are subtractive value, so we do want to make sure we're not going below the defined 1 meter too far. I'm going to set in a value of 0.1 to kind of even that out. I'm going to switch this over to the preview mode just to get a quick representation. It's good to work with the preview mode just to give you an idea of what it looks like. And it's usually a good idea to ignore any of the roughness you see when rendering the preview mode because in fact the final output will differ. But we can see a little bit fuzzier now, a nice little fall off around the edge. Even though the fuzziness top now shows 0 because it rounds, it is in fact there. I do want to increase that a little bit more, so I'm going to type in 0.3, click OK, and we'll just take a look at that really quick. So we can see it extending a lot further. I do know that 1% is just going to be way too much, so I don't want to use that full value. And anytime you hit over 0.5, it is going to round up to the next percentage, so then it will show 1%. I also note that the bump of the water is probably way too high. So just for now, I'm going to take the sea level, or the sea object, change the material scale to 1 for now, and we can modify that layer later if the bumps are too big at this point, and we can see more of a wavy surface. So if I need to, I can bring that. We'll do 0.5. We can also reduce the bump height if needed. So let's take a look at modifying the bank. And we're going to edit the procedural terrain, go into the function. And now this is going to occur after the absolute wave because we're customizing the rivers. What we can do is select the link between the altitude and the absolute wave, add in a filter, and change this over to just the regular filter, which in fact will not modify anything because it's just a straight line between -1 and +1. Although modifying the upper and lower clamping modes will create different results. I'm going to keep them at the default of continue at the moment. Click OK, and what we need is a judge of where the altitude is that we need to define. So what we can do is switch over to a different viewport mode and take a look from the front view. Side view will also work well. But what we can see, and what we want to take a look at, is where the sea level is in relation to the full size of the terrain itself, and how much extends below it, because that's going to be the river bed, and then the bank is going to be where the sea level object is and slightly above it. So in relation to that filter, it'll give us a good idea of where we need to create points to modify just the riverbank and keep the rest of the fractal as intact as possible. So we can go back edit the object, and then we're going to modify that filter. So it was a very, very low amount. And since that window is still open, what we can do is reduce the size of the terrain editor, move it off to the side, and still see that in the front view. And then when we go to edit this filter, we can kind of match that up, and we can tell that we're going to have a very small area. And what I want to do is just double click kind of where the sea level is to create a point. And it may shift the output slightly. You could even it out a little bit more. But I'm going to turn on the grid and zoom in. So this is essentially where our sea level object is going to be. I'm just going to bring that point down to straighten it a little bit more, using the grid as a reference to keep it straight. So now any changes we make below this will modify the river bed, and then anything above it is going to modify the river bank to the point in which we want to create any extra altitude. So I also want to create another point up top, just above, to make sure that everything after it is going to remain the same, and then we can make modifications below this. So if you want to remove that crease, so you don't see that really fine line, you can bring down and add another point, pulling down the bottom point. You don't want to flatten it out completely or bring it to -1, because then it'll just be a completely flat area, unless that's what you want. So that is, of course, a possibility. And then we can adjust and add in additional points to change the river bed. And if we want to go up, create a little bit of a harsher fall off, we can modify the bank. So let's take a look at that with that filter applied, and see what the material is going to look like and what the shape of the terrain will in fact look like with the new setting. So what we can see now are additional creases, basically, or seams across the terrain. That's because we're not using curves in the filter. So we will need to turn on curves to smooth that out. But leaving those on at first gives you a good idea of where it is the filter is extending to. And we can see that that upper point and where it dips down, we have just going around the edges here. And if you need to create less points to give you kind of your first representation of the riverbank and what you're modifying, then sometimes you just want to have a couple of points to subtract that out. But we can see that the dip overall and the way the riverbank looks, it's much flatter, but not completely flat. So we can go back into the terrain, and now we're going to enable the curve mode. But there's one thing we'll have to pay attention to when we do that, and I'm going to turn off the output observer because it's really not going to help us for modifying such a small area. I'm going to go in and edit the filter, and up at the top I'm going to add another point just before the last point. This way we shouldn't get too much of a change when we enable the curves. So we can just kind of go in here and double click, enable curves, and it does look like that top point does need to be reduced just slightly. So we just want to keep that straight. If you do want to round off the tops of your peaks or mountains, you can modify that a little and bring it up if needed. We'll go all the way down to the bottom of the filter. It'd be easier just to zoom out. So now we have this rounded off. And we might want to do the same thing for this top point, just giving us another point to keep it straight, so we're not making too large of an impact on the terrain. But now we can adjust the riverbank, and if you want to make it a little sharper, you can pull it out a little more. If you click and hold down, you can draw out a box to select more points and adjust them all at the same time. So we can just modify that, make the bank a little sharper if needed, and really just customize it in here, which is pretty nice. Click OK. OK again. We'll go ahead and close that out, and we can take a look at the terrain and the riverbank now. And the smaller of adjustments we make, the more detail we're going to be able to get around the edges of the water. If you're still seeing those creases, because we're working with curves, you don't need nearly as many points to define the range. So what we could do is go in and clean up the amount of points we're using to get rid of some of that if needed. But I am going to modify the material now for the brown sand and bring the altitude to, let's go ahead and type in 0.3 meters. And that should reduce the level in which that material is rising to, keeping in mind that is tied now to the sea level object. So if we decide we want to change the sea level, we can raise it up, and that shore material will go with it, but keeping in mind that it will not modify the filter that we just used to define the bank. If you want to create cliffs around the edge, then you're going to need a much faster fall off within that filter. So let's go ahead and make this more of a intense fall off. And we can select the filter and edit it. I'm going to remove that bottom point and make sure that that curve isn't falling below. But if we pull this section over, and this point right here, we're creating a very fast fall off of that number output, which should dip down the terrain, provided we were in the right area. It might have to be a little bit higher, but then we can always select all those points and move them in. And now we can see more of a cliff around the edges of the water, and that's going to be like that throughout the terrain. The very harsh line we're seeing for the grass is automatically being calculated based on the mixed material settings for the main material, and the influence of slope and so on, and doesn't really have that fuzziness option like material layer has. So if you need to really smooth that out, it might be better just to kind of reduce the height of that cliff, or you can round it out the filter just at that point. Adjusting the smooth blending strip might be a little too intense for this material because it's going to modify where all of the peaks are as well. So anywhere we go in the terrain, we're going to be able to see those nice cliffs and cut off around where the water is at. Now I can tell that I do need to reduce the scale of the material for the water and the sea object. I'm going to bring it back down to 0.1 where it was originally. Take the bump and reduce it to 0.1. There's another thing I want to do to improve the highlight, and that is to switch it over to an anisotropic lighting. Unfortunately, the change between 0 and 1% is intense, and usually for this surface won't work very well. So what I'm going to do instead is type in a value of 0.001. Click OK, and that will modify the highlight minimal enough to create a nice gradient and scattering of the light. but not too much, where at 1 it's just way too high. But it does smooth out the surface a bit more, as you can see. And I also like to make a few more modifications, increasing the brightness of the highlight intensity, making it a little shinier, and then under transparency, we can increase the turn reflective width angle, and now I'm going to add another 3 to the end of the refraction index. Not sure if it's going to remember that. It should be stored even though it doesn't actually show up, and that's because the refraction of water really is going to go much further. So that does look a little bit better now, although the color is a bit off, not quite what I want. So we're going to modify the C just a little bit more and make the fade out color more of a kind of brownish, slightly less saturated color. And the light color, I'm going to move a little more towards blue. And that should look a little bit better. We can also adjust the murkiness if you want less transparency based on depth. You can increase that a little higher, and that amount is going to depend on the scale of the scene and how deep the water is, and how far the riverbed extends below the water. So that's a pretty decent start overall. It's starting to look a little bit better. What I want to show you next is how to create a variance of the defined filter we just created and the original output of the shoreline. So that way it's not completely consistent throughout the entire terrain. If you do want to vary it in some areas, it's actually quite easy to set that up. So we're going to do this by editing the procedural terrain, edit the function, and now what we need to do is create a mix or a blend between the filtered altitude and an unfiltered altitude. Or we can create another filter to create more variance. Right now what we're just going to do is have an unfiltered value. So we're going to select between the altitude and this filter and click on the combiner node. By default it should add in the blender, which is what we want to use for this. We're going to connect the input 1 to the absolute wave, so that now we have 0 being the filtered altitude and 1 being the unfiltered altitude. So now if we control the ratio, which we can extract and connect to any numeric output, whether being a noise node or a fractal node, we can create a variance and extra bit of control over the riverbank. What I'm going to do to keep this a very fast generating fractal is just to connect to the altitude at the map. So we're using the altitude to now control this extra bit of variance. If you wanted to reverse it, you could select the link between the map and that ratio, the blender, add another filter, and switch that over to the opposite, and then it'll give a reverse, which can sometimes be pretty effective. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at that. And actually, I do want to go back, select the blender, and select the clip ratio 0 to 1. What that's going to make sure is that we're not creating any extreme altitudes beyond the level of the filter, which could have some undesired effects in this case, because we were working with such a small value. So now, based on the altitude, we're going to have change in the distribution of the riverbank. And if we need to use a different filter or a different fractal to control it, to reduce the scale or overall changes, because this might be based on just a very large area rather than small little differences. And for the most part, in this area of the terrain, that filter or fractal was not enough to really modify this specific area. There's a few points you can pick out that have been changed. They don't have that really fine line. If we move to other areas of the scene, we will see a change, but I think overall they might be a little too large. So what I'm going to do is go back into the object and edit the fractal. And in this case, we might be able to just remove the opposite filter because we might get something a little bit better within a reduced range, because when you use the opposite filter, you normally need to also use the offset filter to pull down the altitude. So it might have just been not really sufficient for this exact terrain. So I'm going to go ahead and re-render this out. So there are still only a few areas that we can see really coming out, and that's mostly because the altitude we're working with right now is more than likely below 0, and we're clipping out the terrain. So what I want to do is just add one more map filter in between that link. So we'll add a filter, change it to map, make sure that the lower value is -1, and then the output range is going to be 0 to 1. We don't need to clip the out of range value because we already have that being clipped within the blender itself. So those default settings should help improve this. If not, we can reduce the height or use another fractal. I like to try to stick with the main fractal just because the less fractals you have in the terrain, the faster the scene is going to render, calculate, because you're still just using that same distribution, which is already being used to generate the terrain. So a much larger difference now, and you can really see a lot more variation up and down throughout where the cliffs are, and some areas that are even protruding from the water now, kind of having some exposed sandbanks. It makes it pretty neat. If you notice, there is a kind of fine line over on the right. That's caused by the sharp fall off between the filter and the different points. So if needed, you might need to reduce some of that cutoff. An easier way might be to add in another material layer just to affect steep areas or flat areas within that altitude range. And I want to add just one more modification to the water. And what I'm going to do is select the sea, edit the material, and I'm going to add another layer. Now this layer I'm going to select meta waters and select the channel water. Click OK. It's going to tell me that we're loading multiple layers. If you just want to load the top layer, select no. So I'm going to select no. And what this is going to do is just add the foam layer, which is distributed using the distance below object, which is an input node. So we can go to color and alpha, edit the function to modify the alpha, and we're going to see the foam meta node that is used to generate this foam. The coast foam depth is set to 100. I'm going to go to edit the object, and by default the distance to object below, which is used to define the foam, is set to view units. I'm just going to go ahead and extract this and publish it within the node, so now we can choose which unit we want to use. I'm going to select meters and change that depth to 0.5. Actually, we'll go ahead and set it to 1 just to start with. And we can adjust the amount in any of these other settings as well. But just that first change might be enough to just add a little bit of a foamy surface to the top. I'll switch to the final render just to get a quick idea of what the foam currently looks like. So I might want to extend the range a little. 1 is a little bit too small for this. And I'm going to be reducing this amount a little bit more. I'm going to click OK, go to the alpha boost, and turn it down a little, which is going to help make it so it's not like ocean waves or ocean foam. And we can just increase that amount more and more. If we want to increase the depth, it'll generate that foam out further into the deeper areas. But because of the variance between that filter we generated or created and the blend with the altitude with the non-filtered zone, we'll also get some nice variations within the distribution of the altitude underneath the water, which will in turn help with creation of the foam layer. And I'm going to make one or two more changes, which is to go in and connect the bump to the foam, but I do want to reverse it. So add a filter, choosing the opposite, add another filter, use the offset, set it to -1, and then I'm also going to change the depth to 3, click OK. Now this is going to be way too much bump, so I'm going to type in 0.01 just to start, and it's going to add these bumps to the bumps underneath. We might need to reduce the bump amount if it's too high, but this is going to create more of a bumpy surface around where the foam is, which can turn out to create fairly neat looking water, a lot more turbulent to really make having the foam on a river make sense. If we need to extend the coverage beyond the meter amount, because it looks like even having that high distance isn't really generating all the way out to the center, we can increase the overall amount within that meta node. So that would be the coast foam amount or coast foam coverage. And you can really just kind of adjust it, modify it. You could also blend it with another fractal if you want to subtract from certain areas. But for the most part, I think that's pretty good to start with, to create some pretty decent looking rivers. And another great advantage to using this technique is that 0 is now defined by the sea level, of course, and it's going to make it very easy to place any additional material layers like ecosystem layers and control the zone around the coasts or around any riverbanks. So if we wanted to add an ecosystem layer and just have it kind of hug the river, all we needed to do is define that altitude range, set it to start at 0, and just raise it up maybe a meter, maybe less, and have an ecosystem just kind of go around the edge. Also defining other elements to add a lot easier. So this method makes it easier just to kind of place a river at 0, being the altitude, even though it might not be completely realistic doing that, because in order for a river to flow, there would need to be a change in elevation. But overall, it does make it quite a bit easier to set up this kind of a scene. And it can be used through a lot of different types of fractals, not just limited to the terrain fractal. So really any fractal that you're working with, it's going to work the same, but you might just need to modify the output value in order to get the rivers to show where you want them. And if any rivers are not connecting, you can just go into the terrain editor and kind of paint in those changes in the altitude and then connect them.